Hello, fellow educators. Welcome to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast, the podcast that gives you weekly scientifically grounded and evidence-based solutions to your behaviour dilemmas, providing a blueprint to developing flexible behaviour solutions that really work for your individual pupils, classes, or even whole school environments. If you're a teacher, a Senko, or even a school leader with a passion for supporting pupil behaviour in a way that is positive and effective, this podcast is for you. My name is Adam Dean, and I'm your host. This week is a really exciting episode. It's our first episode with a guest, and I'm really excited to introduce you to this guest, Kierran Pearce. Hello, Kierran.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
I've known Kierran for, I think it must be about 15 years now, something along those lines.
Yeah, quite that lot. Yeah, it must be.
Yeah, it might well be.
Yeah.
When I first met you, you were an LSA at the school that we were working at. And since then, Kieran's trained as a teacher, worked as a teacher in a special needs school. And then he was always very passionate about special needs, and has really innovated a role and a whole organisation within our local authority called the Multi-Schools Council, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a moment. He's also the author and creator of a wonderful new book that I'm going to put a link for in the show notes called A Toolkit for Teachers, Autism, ADHD and Mental Health. So we'll have a little bit of a talk about those in a bit. Thanks again for coming on the show, Kierran.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. No pressure, like you say, being the first person. But hopefully we get some good stuff out there.
Absolutely, we will. If anyone's listening, Kieran's got loads of really good ideas and has spent a lot of time working with young people at different ages with autism and ADHD. And I know a lot of our listeners, both in the UK and abroad, work with people with autism and ADHD. So I think you're going to have some really good insights. Before we start talking about behaviour and stuff like that, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Multi-Schools Council?
Yeah, of course. So the Multi-Schools was born out of working within a special school, as you mentioned, Adam. And it came from a conversation I had with a young person one day. So this particular girl was concerned, really, that when she left the school, other people weren't going to understand her. Other professionals, other children, and what she wanted to try and do was educate people about things like autism while they were at school. And I said, it's a brilliant idea, but I'll be really honest, how do we do it? And she said, well, we just need to get in touch with our local schools first. So we actually started the Multi-Schools Council back in 2012, which is obviously quite a long time ago.
11 years ago now.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah. And obviously at that time, if people remember back, it was the London and Paralympic and Olympic Games.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was quite a good driver for us because, as you mentioned, when I started at the school, I was an LSA and sport was kind of the remit I had as well. So linking those things together, the first event that we held was we had mainstream secondary schools come along to the school, which was obviously a special school, and our young people ran sports events that maybe they hadn't heard of. So we had things like polybat, new age curling, but also what you'd class as maybe more mainstream sports like football and basketball. And our young people coached the mainstream young people, which flipped things on its head because I'd always seen mainstream children maybe supporting or coaching children with additional needs. So yeah, that was the start, and it just broke down those barriers because, like the same for you, Adam, if I reflect when I was a bit younger, I never stepped inside a special school when I went to school. And I had no awareness about things like autism, and that's what this young girl wanted to change. So it started with sport, and then it's grown over the years. So more and more schools became interested. I then approached the local authority to say, look, this is what we've started. Could you support us? They said, okay, well, we can do 1 day a week. So I was one day released from the school and started to get the awareness out there. we started to go into schools and talk to them about autism and ADHD, and yeah, the work just seemed really popular. So Essex then agreed to kind of 5 days a week of a seconded role. That took kind of years showing the impact, and then yeah, last year, the local authority agreed to make it into a permanent role, which is good, because even, you know, wherever I go on to in the future, it means that there'll be that sustainability, and that work can continue. And we've got 2 youth workers in post now as well. So yeah, it's really grown.
That's fantastic. And I think, I mean, what you're saying there makes so much sense, because I remember back when I used to do outreach and I was sort of supporting setting up some of the autism support centres. It was always really difficult. One of the first things that a lot of the pupils that I worked with there would say it would be that they didn't feel like some of the staff or a lot of the other pupils really understood what they were going through and what their experience was.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's quite a lot of impact in terms of on those young people with autism? Do they feel sort of more included and more secure in school?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, one of the great indicators is usually if we deliver an assembly or a workshop where we talk about autism, 9 times out of 10, a young person will put their hand up in that session and say, "Oh, I've got autism." And yeah, for me, that's brilliant, because it's breaking down that, oh, is it something I can mention? It's, you know, maybe the elephant in the room that people don't know how to address. And like you said, the need for outreach is definitely still needed. But you can understand why, because as I mentioned, at school, we don't ever really talk about it. And then even if we reflect on, you know, we've both been through our teacher training in terms of the amount that's covered. When we look at any area of SEN, it's very limited. So people don't have that awareness or that experience. And it just creates a bit of kind of uncertainty as well. Like, how do we address it? How do we talk about it? So yeah, we do see an impact. I think for me as well, that then leads into our ambassador program. So not only do we then meet the young people in the schools, if any of the young people are really passionate about talking about their differences, then we invite them to become ambassadors, which basically means they get involved in virtual meetings where they talk to other young people who maybe have similar differences, and then we base our projects on what the young people want to see. So yeah, it's just exciting to meet lots of young people who, like you said, can then have the confidence to speak out about themselves.
That's brilliant. I love the fact that you're drawing those links and that you're that the organisation is being led by the young people. I think that's really, really cool. Yeah. If someone's listening to this, and we've got there's a lot of people in the UK listen to this, but then we've also got listeners. I was quite excited to see the other day, I checked, we had some listeners in China, a couple in the US. If there's anyone listening to this and they're in an area where there isn't an organisation like yours, what would be your top tip if they wanted to start this sort of work, even if it was just in their own school or their own classroom?
For me, the top tip is listen to your young people first. So, you know, you might not be working in a special school. Obviously, I was very fortunate to do that. But again, look around you and make sure that you speak to young people, because I think the difference between young people and adults, Adam, is that often as adults, you have kind of things that as much as you'd like to think we can be reflective and change our way of thinking, there are certain things that we've just kind of decided, haven't we, as we've grown up. Whereas children, it's that sponge, isn't it, that we talk about, and they're more open to maybe considering different points of views, I find, in my work. So I guess my top tip would be start with your young people and base it from there, because we've based our work in Essex on what Essex young people have told us and gone from there. Well, even in this country, you know, you could be in, let's just say, Newcastle, the young people there may have different thoughts and feelings about these differences, and actually you might go in a slightly different direction. So yeah, I think listen to them, let them drive it. I mean, usually when I go to places and say, well, this is what young people have said, it's very difficult for professionals to argue with that, because that should be why we're all in our jobs, is for young people. So yeah, use what they say and go with it.
Absolutely. No, I really like that. Or hopefully someone out there is listening in an area where something like this isn't in place and they'll be inspired to go and start up their own multi-schools council. Okay, let's have a little chat about the book. So I've had a chance to look through parts of it. It's obviously about autism and ADHD. I really enjoyed there was a sort of MythBuster section in there, and I was looking through, and there was a few myths in there that I remember addressing a couple of times with pupils in mainstream schools back when I was doing outreach. Just to talk us through a little bit about the book, about what it's about. I suppose its genesis a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So it's kind of been 18 months in the process of writing. So we wrote it alongside one of our ambassadors, a lady called Jen, who has an organization called Jar Jar Books. If you haven't ever heard of that, I would also recommend checking Jar Jar Books out. Jen likes to write books for young people, and is also thinking about kind of diversity and language within that. So a lot of bilingual books. Also, within a lot of her books, she provides sign language as well, like the signs within it, so that people can learn sign language to go along with the words. So, yeah, we sat down with Jen, and it's basically capturing the sessions that we deliver in schools. So our autism awareness workshops, our ADHD awareness workshops, and our mental health work is trying to capture them and get them into a book. But at the same time, what we wanted to do was make sure it was something that people could just pick up and use and reflect on quite quickly. You know, again, you'll know yourself, Adam, being within education, it can be a very busy place. And we had to think realistically, you know, how many teachers or people, not just teachers, support staff are going to sit down and read a 300 to 400 page book. That was what the children came up with and said, look, we need to think, and they had very valid points. So what we've just tried to do, I guess, is pick out the key messages that we deliver in the schools, some of the feedback that we get from young people on what we deliver. And as somebody's already said to us who's kind of read the book, they feel it's just a good resource to have, that if you're at a bit of a sticking point, you might just delve into the toolkit and think, you know, this is what young people have said has helped them. It might, and obviously every young person can be different, but you might just then try and apply that to the young person you're working with. So, I mean, our aim is to just try and get it into as many schools across the country. You know, we're always ambitious at the multi schools. You've worked with me, Adam, as well. You know, I'm very ambitious person. And, you know, our aim is to get it into every kind of school in the country. So, yeah, we also want feedback at this point. I'm speaking to you, Adam, I think within maybe 3 or 4 weeks that it's been kind of published. So we're not sitting here thinking that we've got it all right. I'm sure there's things in there that people have different views on, and that's great, because we want it to create conversation as well. We want to be challenged. So for people to say, you know, why have you posted like this? Or we would usually describe it in this way. And we're open to that as well. So yeah, looking for feedback too.
That's really good. That's really exciting. I suppose what an interesting question would be, I haven't covered autism so far. We haven't actually started to delve into any additional needs. So it'd be really interesting. You sort of said the key takeaways there for autism and ADHD. What would you say and I know you haven't got a copy of the book in front of you, but off the top of your head, what would you say you have got a copy of the book in front, of course. Brilliant. What would you say the key takeaways would be for autism?
Okay. So I think the starting point really is that, and it's something I've heard you say actually, Adam, before, that if you've met one child with autism, you've only met one child with autism. As I say, I remember you talking about that. And yeah, I think that's the key point, first of all, that we try and get across in the book, that, you know, you might be working with one child who has autism 1 year, and you might apply some of this stuff and it works. And then the next year you try and apply the same things and it doesn't work, and you're sitting there scratching your head. Well, it's to reflect on the fact that actually, very different. So I know that's very at a basic level, but that's, you know, the first takeaway. I think we talk a lot in there around the fact that young people with autism will communicate in very different ways. And I know we're going to go on to talk about behaviour, but one of the sayings that we talk about is that, you know, every behaviour is a form of communication. So if a child is behaving in a certain way and they do have a diagnosis of autism, have we looked at all of the different things that might be impacting on that young person? So that's when we might draw in things like how they process different sensory kind of inputs, and looking at having a whole picture on that, not just putting it down to one thing that might have happened in the day, but actually thinking about, okay, has the lights changed in the room, for example? Has there been a different in the sound, the sound levels that might be happening, all of those things, the smells in the room, etc. And just trying to get people to think a bit more holistically, I think is another takeaway from that. And also talking about the different challenges around kind of socializing and social skills, and maybe some of the strategies to support with that. But also bearing in mind that, for some young people, we go into school sometimes where they'll say, well, we've got this young person with autism who doesn't really seem to be engaging with lots of people and doesn't have a big peer group. And we, a response we would ask first of all is, are they happy? Or are you able to say they're happy? Because actually that might be our need, that we think, oh, they're not. But actually for them, if we think about a classroom, a mainstream classroom especially, it could be a very busy place. And actually that playground space might be that time that they need to kind of get away from that hustle bustle. And so we talk in there as well about making sure we're basing it on the child's needs and understanding their needs rather than what we think they need based on us. I'd say that's another key takeaway from the autism section as well. And just like you mentioned in there, the kind of myth busting, I guess, as well. There's key takeaways in there, because all the myths that are within this book are things that young people have asked us, or their families may have been asked at different times, such as things like, can I catch autism? I still get asked
absolutely.
that now. So,
not always by children, sometimes members of the public.
yeah, absolutely. Or even, staff working in schools. And as I've already said in this episode, I understand that we don't talk about it enough. So as soon as we can break that barrier down, that answers that question. But yeah, there's a few myths in there that young people have asked. So I'd say they're the key takeaways. It's that kind of communication, how young people process different bits of information, socializing, and basing it not on our needs, but the needs of young people.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes it, the social thing especially. I remember a couple of times talking to teachers, and they were like, they every single time they're in this lesson, they start doing this, and this, and it doesn't make any sense, because this is the fun lesson where they get to, they're doing group work. And it was always, well, they might enjoy, like, just because they're autistic doesn't mean they can't be social and they can't enjoy working with people. But there's a good chance that you're adding a whole other workload onto them by making them do work and be social at the same time. So it's sort of like that's additional. And like you say, all of the sensory stuff and things like that. I think it's so powerful to get the message out there about that everyone's affected by these things, but that they're all individuals. Because I think I've noticed as a population, especially in Britain, we tend to get stuck on a particular archetype of autism at some point. So with Sheldon Cooper, everyone suddenly is a physicist, or there was this brilliant book, The Story of the Dog in the Nighttime, fantastic, but then suddenly everyone's a mathematician. So it's I mean, and having had a look through it, it's really interesting to see, especially like you said about all the different methods of communication. And as you know, vast majority of the pupils I work with now where I am communicate via some sort of augmented communication, some sort of picture exchange or something like that. And we are going to do an episode at some point on pupils that have those sorts of communication needs, because there are a lot of them in mainstream schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding that more and more so, I think, we all understand, there's different pressures and on special schools and the numbers that might need that provision, or it might not be they need that provision. It might just be because there could be a different approach in mainstream. But yeah, I think we see that a lot, and we try in our sessions, especially in our assemblies, we use like a skipping rope and a brain, and we move the brain across the skipping rope. I know some people might prefer to use a circle, and that there's different conversations around that, but just to show that, like you said, not everybody is a mathematician or a Sheldon Cooper, but that some young people might be at different ends of the spectrum, and actually, you know, like you said, communicating using pictures or using different ways. We try to say that actually that doesn't mean that somebody's highly intelligent and somebody isn't, because actually it's different. It's just different ways of the brain working. So yeah, that's how we try and describe it.
So ADHD. I know less about ADHD, if I'm honest. We've got some pupils with ADHD as well as autism, but give me some key takeaways for ADHD.
Okay, so I think again, similar to the autism, is that kind of overriding statement we try and start with. With ADHD, obviously, again, everybody is different, but the key message we got from young people and from the schools is that often ADHD can be seen or described or labeled as a behavioural difficulty. Okay, so we hear that that, oh, it's because they've got ADHD. They've, you know, almost blaming the diagnosis. Now, what we try and explain in this book is that, again, we link it back to the brain and the fact that the brain will be working in different ways. And sometimes, again, it's just about how we as adults might display information to a young person. We might be describing things in a very different way to how they're processing things. So we talk about that. We talk about the fact that we obviously spoke with young people, but also lent on a book called ADHD Living Without Breaks. That's another really good book, really quite quick and easy to pick up and get some pointers from. But the living without breaks kind of concept is something that has resonated with children we've worked with. So we talk about the fact that, to try and explain it to some young people, and this is where, when we're trying to not be overcomplicated with our language, but if we're trying to explain that we have breaks in our brain, for some people that's like, whoa, what does that mean? But we try and simplify it and talk about the fact that, you know, in different situations, if we imagine that we're going down a hill, some young people will obviously put the brakes on when it gets too fast and when they know they need to slow themselves down. With ADHD, those brakes are still there, but they might just take a little bit longer to get pulled. So we might think about the strategies we use in the classroom or just anywhere as paths that we need to think about and consider. So some of the perceptions from young people is that, oh, if a child's leaving the classroom to go and do, let's say, a movement break, oh, that's because they can't behave. Like that's sometimes what some young people think. Or, you know, why are they doing that and I don't get the chance to? We talk about the fact that that's like a path on their hill that they need just to help regulate how they're feeling, and then they can get back to their task or whatever it might be, or move on to the next thing. So we use that kind of wording around how it's been explained to us from young people around living without breaks. But then the strategies, so breaks are still there. It's just about finding the right strategies to help a young person. We also talk about young people with ADHD having a bit of a singular focus. So obviously ADHD, we think about maybe losing attention sometimes and finding attention difficult, which obviously can be the case. But sometimes it's, what is it that hooks a young person in? Because actually, if we get the right thing that hooks a young person, then actually their attention can be quite good for some young people. So it's thinking about, how do we display information? So we might need a visual stimulus, for example, first of all, to hook that person in. And then at transition points, rather than just stopping immediately and moving on to something else, have we got something there that might support that young person to make that transition just a little bit easier? Because if they have a singular focus, it might be quite hard then to move from one thing onto the next. So that's another key bit in there. And again, the myth busting, I think, you know, again, talking about, one of the key things is, ADHD is an excuse to misbehave. So this came from young people saying, oh, you know, if you've got ADHD, you could just say you've got ADHD and do what you want. And in the book, we explained that when we speak to children, we say that if we were to do something that wasn't positive on the street and we ended up in front of a judge and we said to the judge, well, sorry, judge, I've got ADHD, I couldn't help it, that's not gonna work. So we just normalize it and say that everybody is, can reflect on themselves, and we can always improve, our choices about things. The strategies that then go alongside that aren't because a young person is favoured. It's just because that's how their brain's working, and they might just need to work in a slightly different way. So, yeah, I think they're the kind of key takeaways for the ADHD section. I'd say there's a lot more strategies and that's only because the young people have given us more in that section, whereas the autism stuff still has strategies in, but talks more about that general awareness of autism.
That makes sense. That's brilliant. I really like the analogy of the brakes. That made a lot of sense to me in terms of our pupils here, actually. So thank you for that.
That's okay.
And the other subject that's in here is mental health, and that I'm really interested in because I know that anxiety and depression are both obviously they're conditions in of themselves, but they're both obviously very often comorbid with autism. So did you find that was a whole separate section, or did you find that some of it sort of overlapped?
Some of it definitely overlaps, which is why we wanted to include it in this toolkit, because you're obviously spot on that, we get quite frustrated. I say we, like me and the young people I work with, that when we talk about mental health services in general terms, a lot of the times the support can be very mainstream focused, almost to the point, and we've heard it from stories from young people themselves where they're turned away from services because they're described as too complex, or because they have a diagnosis, they can't support them. And we know that young people who may have additional needs are more likely to develop a mental health challenge at some point in their life. So we find it pretty strange that we don't put more effort into preparing health professionals to have more awareness of SEN and actually base more programs that support young people around, people who may be autistic, for example. So part of the book talks about that, and actually thinking about using what we've said around autism and ADHD, and then how we might apply that to supporting young people's mental health. The key kind of concepts that it's based around are Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We really just try and draw it back to thinking about each layer of Maslow, and actually, again, how that might look different for somebody with autism, and the kind of outside influences that might impact each layer, but then thinking about the strategies that can still be applied to support those young people. So, yeah, I feel like the mental health section is something that I feel like we'll write another book one day, because, again, like I said, we're always ambitious. And I think that's something we'll again continue to explore. But there's some strategies in there again. There's advice on like further support, like good kind of charities that we've worked with in the past or we're all aware of. And yeah, just helping create that conversation around early intervention. So yeah, that it's important to say, actually, Adam, the mental health section is not kind of talking about maybe young people who we would describe it that tier 3, tier 4 kind of real kind of critical, need that real in-depth support, because I myself wouldn't be qualified enough to write that, but it's about early intervention strategies that hopefully could prevent young people getting to those later tiers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I was going to say is I think one of the really powerful things about this book, in terms of supporting all of the different categories that it covers, is just helping increase acceptance from pupils and from staff, because I think the more people know, especially when it's coming from young people that are experiencing that, the more they're going to be able to experience it. The other thing I was going to say is, it's interesting you talk about accessing health services. I wonder if there's some scope in a book like this for health professionals, because that is something where a lot of our pupils, I think, really struggle, because the health service is doing its best to support everybody, but there's not a lot of knowledge there about autism and ADHD. So that maybe one of them for doctors at some point.
That's a really good idea. It's a really good idea. I mean, we've worked with some of the local mental health kind of outreach teams that have some of the contracts in the schools, and some of their practitioners have been really honest to say that even within their training to go into those schools, they have very minimal knowledge. So yeah, that's a great idea, Adam. I'll make a note of that.
Okay, thank you. That's brilliant. So what I'm going to do, I will make sure I put a link to your book in the show notes, and I'll make sure I put a link to Multi Schools Council, and I'll put a link to, was it Jar Books as well?
Jar Jar
I'll have a
Books,
little look, and I'll put a link in there for that.
Thank you.
So I feel like we've sort of touched on behaviour as we go, because a lot of what you're talking about in terms of knowledge of autism and ADHD and mental health sort of links in with how we can best support behaviour. But is there anything, like, are there a couple of key takeaways that you found either in writing the book or working with young people, or even in your own teaching practice, in terms of best practice for behaviour support with young people with autism and ADHD or mental health difficulties?
Yeah, I think, and again, I know it's going to sound very basic, but I think that because it has to start with this, I think it has to be the crux around knowing the individual and the relationships that you build with those young people. So I think, it's much easier to support someone and understand where they're coming from if you've spent time to build those, those strong relationships. And I think if we relate it to school settings, that's across the board with all your kind of staff members. So those young people feel comfortable within the setting. Thinking more specifically about autism, I guess for me, some of the real clear things that I have never really steered away from is that preparation and being really clear with expectations and having a plan and kind of trying to have a bit of consistency. I think is really important. Now, it's the balance, isn't it, between helping young people to understand that in life change happens, but delivering that in a way at the right time and at the right moment to help young people, feel like, rather than saying, oh, well, they just have to get used to change because it happens. I think it is about doing it in a way that works for that young person. So change is, having structure, having, I think, clear expectations and boundaries, and that's both for obviously the young people, but also for the staff that you work with. If, again, general rule, it's not going to apply to everyone because, as we've already said, everyone with autism is different. But if we think about young people really learning kind of based on routine, if we've got an approach that 90% of our staff are using and then 10% aren't, that can be quite damaging.
Yes. Yeah. Consistency is so important.
So I think kind of trying to be on the same page as much as possible with that young person. But also, we've already spoken about the fact that young people can communicate in different ways, not dismissing because of age or the way they communicate that a young person can't express how they feel. Actually, always going back to, how does this young person feel? Have we taken that into account? Have we given time to allow that person to express or involve them? If you're putting maybe an intervention in place, how can you involve them in that process? Now, that can be, more challenging, again, depending on need or age. But, often now we're blessed with the fact we have good technology. We have many more ways of communicating with people as well. So keeping an open mind on how to do that, I think, is really, really important when it comes to behaviour.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you say, it can be really difficult, but the more you can involve the young person. I mean, I always think of it from the point of view of, well, not from the point, but if someone was to say to me, oh, we're going to bring in sort of some changes in policy around staff behaviour in schools or something, I'd want to be involved in that. And I know that my staff here would want to be involved in that conversation, even if there was a rule that was to do with something that I didn't, or that if we're setting rules for pupils, even if it's, you're going to have to do this thing and it's not something they want to do, it's still a conversation that they should be part of if at all possible. I think that's really powerful, definitely. And consistency. I bang on about that even when we're not talking about autism, that if you're going to come up with a rule or a behaviour support system or anything like that, you need to be consistent, and all the staff need to be consistent. And I think the biggest problem with people not being consistent is lack of trust. And as soon as you lose trust with any sort of behaviour support, then it becomes invalid, doesn't it? It's not something that works anymore. Yeah, no, that's really useful. Thank you. How about, I suppose, pitfalls, things that really don't work that you'd like to see avoided?
I mean, I know it's something we've already kind of touched on briefly even before coming on and speaking today, but isolation, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, as I say, I know we've already had a very brief chat, but I think, I just can't see, and nobody's been able to sit down and kind of justify or explain in a way that I think a young person would really accept or understand, you know, how that is going to help. The fact that we still in 2023 think about kind of isolation units as being an effective way to deal with behaviour is very worrying. So I think in terms of pitfalls or real do's and don'ts, I think, really looking at everything else before it gets to the point of, I think it's always, you want to be able to make sure you're keeping young people safe. I think that's important, isn't it? And there's so many more ways you can do things to keep people safe rather than sticking someone in isolation. So I think that's the do's and don'ts for me. Another kind of pitfall for me sometimes is, obviously a lot of our work is working in schools, but we also try and connect with the community and parents where we can as well. And one of the big frustrations, I guess, from parents is where they might have a young person who is very different at home to how they are in school, and almost that disbelief sometimes from the school's point of view. When we go into schools, we say, look, you must always be open to accepting that, okay, a young person may act very differently from 9 to 3 and home, because home and school are two very, very different environments. I'm sure me and you, Adam, are very different to what we like at home to how we are in the workplace. Doesn't mean we're different people. It's just,
the different hat, we can behave differently. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's about getting, I think, people to reflect on that as well. And we know in the book we do mention about masking, and we spoke, obviously both boys and girls can mask, but we had a little small working group of girls who all have autism who spoke about masking from their perspective, and it was really eye-opening to hear them talk about it and the damage it can have if that's not believed, if it's almost we've heard things before like, they must be making it up, or it must be this or it must be that. So that for me that's a real pitfall as well, is not kind of believing parents. The third one I want to mention as well, I know you've said about autism, but just to link it into ADHD again, where we've heard kind of horror stories of things like, we can't teach your child unless they're medicated, almost seeing like seeing medication as the answer. Now again, we've worked with young people who have ADHD who are now taking medication, and it really works for them, and they like the fact that they're taking medication. But on the flip side, we've worked with young people who were put onto medication and it's really had a negative effect on their mental health, and it's really kind of changed their personality as well. And I think we have to be really careful. That's where we link in with health professionals to make sure we get, parents have advice on that, children have advice on that. And it's not just something that as educators we say because we think it's going to be almost like a golden pill to change.
No, absolutely. I always think with medication, it should be the thing you do after you've tried other stuff, rather than we're having some trouble, let's go down the medication route. And obviously you're always led by the medical professionals and things like that. But yeah, you're right. It I feel like is part of a recipe to support. It's not the cure, is it?
No.
That's absolutely. I want to come back briefly to the isolation thing, just because I always find when I can't remember, I wouldn't say where it was anyway, but I remember visiting a school, it was about 10 years ago now, and talking about isolation, and I was still relatively early in my I think I'd done my autism masters, but I hadn't done my training in behaviour analysis. And they said, oh yeah, we're using this, and as a I can't remember the word, but like almost the threat of it works for 90% of the kids. Like just the fact that, that stops. But those are all the kids that were already behaving pretty much, maybe a couple on the edge. but it doesn't work for this 10%. And I remember saying, well, then it doesn't work, does it? Because that's the 10% you're trying to support. You know, you're not, the others don't need that sort of support. And the other interesting thing I found when we were talking specifically about autism there was the amount of pupils that were having troubles at lunch, especially lunch or break, or in particular lessons where they had to be social, or there was something going on around bullying. And these children were every day doing something and getting sent into isolation. And I sort of had to point out, well, maybe they're doing that on purpose. Maybe isolation's a good thing for them because actually something's going on, either with bullying or just the intensity of that social situation, especially in secondary schools. I mean, they're such social environments. I remember going long time ago, but they're intensely social, aren't they? And everyone's learning social rules and things like that. And, you know, that opportunity to actually, if I do this, I get to get taken away from that is really powerful. And the thing that a couple of times I remember suggesting was, why don't you give them the option to be able to go and sit somewhere quiet in their lunchtime for 10, 15 minutes? Because like you were saying earlier, they might need that rest from that social interaction. And if they go outside, people are going to keep bothering them, or they need that time. And actually, if they are a pupil that stims or engages in some sort of repetitive behavior, but they're very socially aware in that they don't want to do it in front of their peers, maybe they need a bit of space to do that. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but
yeah, no, I think it touches on lots of things actually that it's prompted me that maybe I could have brought up earlier, but I haven't. I think, I mean, like you were saying, it's about seeing the big picture there, isn't it? Because you know, you might just see that young person who's getting into difficulty at lunchtime, and like you said, then saying, "Oh, we'll put them into isolation." It's very narrow-minded, and I think it is really important to, you know, see a big picture and consider all of the different things that might be happening for that young person. I totally agree with that. Like you said, they might then be doing that on purpose because that's their out and they've learned. We did a piece of work in the summer term of the last academic year where we asked young people about school attendance, and this was young people with and without SEN. And the big thing that came out kind of from all groups was that bullying was still the number one reason why young people don't want to be in school or may not enjoy school. And so there's lots to consider, and especially in the secondary school environment, there's lots to consider there in terms of how we approach bullying, I think, and how we look at young people really good, because they were saying we don't just need to be supporting young people who have been bullied, we also need to be looking at why people bully.
Yes, absolutely. That's got to be a big part of the mental health conversation as well, hasn't it? Absolutely.
You know, we've linked in lots of work around self-esteem and how people might be feeling about themselves and how that might be portrayed onto others. So yeah, I think that, you know, like I said, young people open our eyes to these things. And the book, not to always go on about the book, but in our sessions in schools, we talk about stimming and again, just trying to create a bit of awareness about that, because you know, I'd love to live in a place where, you know, society doesn't turn its nose up at the fact that some people might need stim. And I think awareness is getting better, but, you know, we still hear of things that might get posted online of people making fun of people who stim. You know, we know that still happens. So it's trying to, move away from the fact that it's this real abstract thing that somebody who's really strange does, when actually just, you know, building a bit of understanding about why people may do it. But just going back how you opened that piece, Adam, I think, like you said, when you went into that school and they were talking about, just the threat. Well, even just that language they're using, like the threat.
Yeah.
Like, is that a society that we want to like create?
Well, this is it.
Yeah.
And actually, we know, and I've talked about this in a previous episode when I talked about just punishment in general, and in behavior analysis, punishment is just something that happens after a behavior that stops it happening again in the future. So in terms of a threat, it's not technically a punishment. It's just, you know, that this will happen if. But if that worked, then we wouldn't have any crime, would we? Because nobody wants to go to prison. and yet people still commit crimes. And we used to have the death penalty, but people still did stuff. And we used to have corporal punishment in school, but people still did things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have needed the corporal punishment. We'd all just be walking around behaving perfectly all the time because we'd all be terrified of the state doing something to us. But that's not how behavior or people work.
No.
So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Any of that sort of language is yeah, I'm not in favor of. I don't know whether it will have gone out before or after this episode, but there's a couple of episodes I've done around behavior contracts that will hopefully link into that quite well, because that's about saying it's sort of, these are the behaviors that we're aiming for and these are the things that will happen if. But I'm quite clear in that if you're going to do a behavior contract, I want it to be, these are the positive things we want to see, and these are the positive things that will happen if, rather than where I've seen it in, especially whole school systems before, it's been, there's a couple of those and they're really vague. Like if you're good, then you get extra playtime, but someone define good for me. But then it will say, if you swear, you lose 5 minutes of playtime. And it's just this big list of negative things and all the negative stuff that will happen if you do them. So, yeah.
And that's what we found with the attendance work, is that it was like, you must come to school, you must do this. Now, we want young people to be in school where possible, although we also know that some young people benefit from learning in different ways. But just by saying to young people, you must, like you said, that doesn't work. Like it's thinking about, why should young people want to be in school, and work with them to think about it, rather than just going from the threat to then, especially with attendance, we found it can then, lead to very quickly going down you're going to be fined or your family's going to be fined. When actually that's very narrow-minded, actually exploring what's at play here. Why is it that a young person doesn't feel comfortable to be in school?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, thinking back to when I was a teenager, if someone said you must do something, then that would be the opposite of the thing I would want to do. I talk quite often about the fact that I was a massive pain in the bum when I was at school. And so I identify quite strongly with a lot of those young people sometimes.
Same, absolutely same. It's like when you walk past, I don't know if you still do it now, Adam, someone says, oh, don't touch that. You want to touch it. Oh, yeah, definitely.
If there's a sign that says don't press this red button, you want to press the red button.
Yeah.
But my favourite thing was always, and I think it's less... No, I think I have seen it with some people with autism. I think it's just a general rule for children. There's the sort of what we'd call social reinforcement, so sort of attention from peers, where they'll do something, and then I used to wind up my German teacher, mainly because I didn't like her and she didn't like me, and I was very aware of that. Yeah. And she'd send me out of the class, which meant I annoyed and got some negative attention from someone that I didn't like and didn't like me. I avoided German, which I hated at that point. Yeah. And then I could look through the window and make faces at my mates. So I got loads of attention. And I think that's where people don't think. Like you said earlier, they don't think about the bigger picture. And I mean, that's my situation was far less complicated because I was deliberately being a pain in the bottom. But most of the guys we're talking about, it's not. We talk about functions of behavior, and the functions of behavior for them are there. It's not conscious like it was for me, like I'm going to play up and then this will happen, but they're still there. But people don't think of that. They just see a naughty child and think, well, then they need to be punished. There needs to be a consequence. There needs to be this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it is, I think, like we said, that language still, I think, I've seen some shifts. I'll be really honest. I have started to see some shifts and think, some schools really do get it right, and people working with young people really do get it right. But there's still that kind of negative way of thinking, and that words like threat, like we said, it's just not helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much, Kierran. I think, we've covered a huge amount there. If anybody is interested in buying the book, and I do really encourage you to buy one, at least one for each school, like Kierran said, I think that would be good. And if we could get a couple sold outside of the country, even better. I'll put the link in the show notes. That's a toolkit for teachers. Autism, ADHD and Mental Health. And I'll also put a link into the Multi-Schools Council for anyone that's interested in just having a look at what those guys do, or even setting something up like that themselves. Thank you very much, Kierran.
Brilliant. Cheers, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. To make sure you don't miss future episodes, click the subscribe button and share this podcast with others. The more people that listen, the more help I can provide. To learn more and to find our social media pages, visit www.classroombehavioursolutions.com. See you next time on the Classroom Behaviour Solutions podcast. Thank you.